The one says, "What a wonderful story is this?" And the other replies, "The remainder of it is more surprising." The lines of this dialogue, or some variation of them, take place every night before daybreak in what one could consider as the emblem of storytelling in general, 1001 Nights, introduced in Europe by the French Orientalist Antoine Galland, who translated this collection of stories and started publishing them in 1704, based on manuscripts from the 14th or 15th century. They are now kept at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris with Galland's marginal annotations on them. For example, you can see here the numbering of the nights. Galland added to the manuscripts some other stories that were supposedly told to him by an oral source. This composite French text was then almost immediately translated in English in 1706 by an unknown translator, and it was published under the title of Arabian Nights Entertainments. With its anonymous and compilatory character, this first English version evokes what Walter Benjamin, in his essay on the storyteller, imagined as, I quote, "a web nets which all stories together form in the end, a network or a texture of texts in which all the possible narratives would be interwoven." I quote Benjamin, "One ties on to the next, as the great storyteller, particularly the Oriental ones, have always readily shown. In each of them there is a Scheherazade who thinks of a fresh story whenever her tale comes to a stop." End of quote. Strikingly, when he mentions again the 1001 Nights later in his essay, Benjamin emphasizes, I quote, "the by no means insignificant share which traders, Handeltreibenden, so those who deal in commerce, had in the art of storytelling. Not so much in the content of the stories told, than by, I quote, refining the tricks with which the attention of the listener was captured." End of quote. Storytelling, Benjamin adds, plays a crucial role in the household of humanity, im Haushalt der Menschheit. Now, the word Haushalt in German clearly belongs to an economic or financial paradigm. It means not only household, but also budget. And Haushalten, the verb that corresponds to the noun, means to manage, to economize. In sum, storytelling, Benjamin suggests, is closely tied to what in Greek was called oikonomia, the management of the house or home. Indeed, narration might well have an intrinsically economic dimension. So, with an eye to this economic fabric or texture of narration, let us reread the end or the interruption of the first of the 1001 Nights, of which we have already read 2 lines. "The storyteller has hardly begun her story when dawn approaches and threatens to break." I quote, "As Scheherazade had spoke those words," I'm quoting the 1706 English translation. "As Scheherazade had spoke those words, perceiving it was day, and knowing that the Sultan rose betimes in the morning to say his prayers and hold his counsel, Scheherazade held her peace," stopped talking. "Lord, sister," says Dinarzade, "what a wonderful story is this? The remainder of it," says Scheherazade, "is more surprising, and you will be of my mind if the Sultan will let me live this day and permit me to tell it out next night." Shahryar, who had listened to Scheherazade with pleasure, says to himself, "I will stay till tomorrow, for I can at any time put her to death when she has made an end of her story." End of quote. Contrary to what is generally believed, Scheherazade doesn't tell her stories to the Sultan, her husband. She tells them to her sister, Dinarzade, so that the Sultan could hear them. The addressee of the narratives is double. They are narrated not to be only heard, but also to be overheard or heard twice at the same time. Within this oblique or triangulated narrative structure, it doesn't take long before we hear about debt. The word occurs in the story of the merchant and the genie, when it is continued during the second night, after Shahryar has decided to let Scheherazade live for one more day out of, if I may put it so, narratological curiosity. This story strikingly mirrors the story that frames it, that is to say, Scheherazade's own story. I quote, "When the merchant saw that the genie was going to cut off his head, he cried out aloud and said, 'For heaven's sake, hold your hand, allow me one word, be so good as to grant me some respite.'" End of quote. Once he is granted this respite of 1 year, the merchant goes home to his wife and children. Quote, "Next morning, the merchant applied himself to put his affairs in order and first of all to pay his debts." So this first thematic or diegetic mention of debt, and there will be many others, occurs within a narrative that in its turn soon includes other narratives. After his 1 year respite is over, the merchant goes back to where the genie expects him in order to kill him, and there he meets 3 old men. The first old man asks that the genie suspend his anger for the time of a story in the story that will elicit forgiveness. "You will pardon the poor unfortunate man," that is the merchant, the third of his crime. The story told by the old man within the story of the merchant and the genie told by Scheherazade thus introduces the idea that a story can bring about forgiveness, that is to say, absolution, but not a complete absolution at once, rather an absolution that happens step by step, portion after portion. Quote, "When the first old man, sir," continued the Sultaness, "had finished his story, the second addressed himself to the genie and says to him, 'I am going to tell you what happened to me, and I am certain you will say that my story is yet more surprising than that which you have just now heard, but when I have told it to you, I hope you will be pleased to pardon the merchant the second third of his crime.'" End of quote. Absolution occurs by installments, so to speak. After this second old man, who happens to be also a merchant, it is the third old man's turn to tell his story to the genie. We anticipate that when its narration will be completed, the genie will forgive the 3/3 of the merchant's guilt. But its completion, deferred by the interruption brought about by daybreak, is surprisingly elliptical. When Scheherazade resumes her narrative during the 8th night, she confesses for the first time that she is unable to tell the expected story. Quote, "Sir," replies the Sultaness, "the third old man told his story to the genie. I cannot tell it to you because it is not come to my knowledge, but I know that it did so much exceed the 2 former stories in the variety of wonderful adventures that the genie was astonished at it, and no sooner heard the end of it, but he said to the third old man, 'I remit the other third part of the merchant's crime upon the account of your story.'" End of quote. The narrative completion that allows for complete forgiveness thus appears as unfulfilling, and it has to be compensated by another story, the story of the fisherman that occupies the remaining time of the missing but complete story told by the third old man. Quote, "Dinarzade, perceiving that the Sultan demurred, says to her, 'Sister, since there is still some time remaining, pray tell us the story of the fisherman. If the Sultan is willing.' Shahryar agreed to it, and Scheherazade, resuming her discourse, pursued it in this manner." End of quote. Other days and other nights pass. Scheherazade narrates how, in his turn, the fisherman tells another story to another genie. And when she interrupts her narration after the 11th night, her sister Dinarzade addresses her with a new variant of the formula we have by then already heard so many times. I quote, "The 12th night was far advanced when Dinarzade called and says, 'Sister, you owe us the continuation of the agreeable history of the Grecian king and the physician Douban. I am very willing to pay my debt,' replies Scheherazade, and resumed the story as follows." End of quote. So here, the anonymous translator of the English edition of Arabian Nights has supplemented Galland's French text. The English rewriter or reteller interpolates the word debt in a passage that doesn't include it. Je le veux bien, répondit Scheherazade. En même temps, elle en reprit le fil de cette sorte. And this with the effect of introducing indebtedness on the meta-diegetic level too. Not only does Scheherazade tell stories that tell stories that tell stories about debt, but she is indebted in her very storytelling. In other words, her narration itself has the structure of debt. Arbitrary as it seems, the English translator's interpolation is nonetheless dictated by a rigorous necessity. For what he translates are not only Galland's words, but the whole underlying logic of a narrative made of and about narratives, a narrative that constantly interweaves narrating and absolving. To absolve, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, is not only to acquit or set free from blame, guilt, etc., but also, I quote, to accomplish, complete, bring to completion. In the frame story of 1001 Nights, Scheherazade's predicament is that she can't pay off her debt. Her guilt, in the Sultan's eyes, is simply to be what she is, i.e. a woman and a wife, and as such she deserves to die. This structural and hence irredeemable debt drives her to indebt herself infinitely, to open more and more narrative accounts without closing or absolving them, precisely in order to stay solvent. Her narratological solvency can only be exhausted when at the very end the Sultan decides to forgive her, lui faire grâce, writes Galland, thereby absolving her narrative, completing it, and at the same time absolving her from the obligation to narrate. But the frame story of Scheherazade's indebtedness and absolution might itself be part of a larger frame story. Her narrative of debt and as debt might itself belong to a broader narrative, a narrative about what Benjamin, in his essay on the storyteller, called the household of humanity, inasmuch as this household or management pertains to an economy of ending as well as to the end or ends of economy. In order to tell at least a part of this frame story for the frame story of Scheherazade's storytelling, we should fittingly begin by the end, then, by what has for a long time been the very word for end or ending, that is to say, surprisingly, finance. The first two senses listed by the Oxford English Dictionary for finance are the following. They are both marked with a cross, indicating that the meaning in question is dead, has ended, has reached its end. I quote, first, ending an end, obsolete, rare. 2, settlement with a creditor, payment of a debt, compensation or composition paid or exacted. End of quote. One of the occurrences of the word given as an example of the first sense, ending or end, is to be found in John Bullock's dictionary published in London in 1616, An English Expositor. There, so at the top of the first column of the page, one reads this laconic definition that to our contemporary ears almost sounds like a sentence without a verb. I quote, finance, comma, an end. The reason for the asterisk that precedes the word is explained in the brief introduction to the reader, toward the middle of the paragraph. Remember also that every word marked with this mark, asterisk, is an old word only used of some ancient writers and now grown out of use. End of quote. Like the cross in the Oxford English Dictionary entry, the asterisk here remarks the meaning or folds it onto itself. Finance as ending has ended. In sum, before the word finance ended up, if I may say so, acquiring its modern sense, that is to say the management of money, it meant ending or end. Do we have to infer that it has later developed a meaning contrary to its meaning? Has finance become infinite? I will let these questions resonate and wait, and I will continue my attempt at telling the frame story for the frame story of Scheherazad's narratological indebtedness. Let us pursue then our etymological inquiry into the history of finance. The etymology of finance leads back to the French word finance, itself derived from the verb finer. The Littré Dictionary, 1881, gives the following brief indication, and I will translate. Finance, the ancient language used fine, derived from the Latin finis and meaning properly to finish. The participle was finant, hence finance, like from croyant, croyance. Finance, then, seems to have been formed as the present participle of fine. It was the ending in progress, so to speak, the very process of ending. More exhaustively than the Littré, the Dictionnaire du Moyen Français, a dictionary of Middle French that you can find on the internet, lists a number of meanings for the verb finer and classifies them as pertaining on the one hand to the notions of term, end, or completion, with a transitive use as well as an intransitive use, used intransitively, and we have to bear that in mind. Finer means to die. And then, on the other hand, there are meanings that pertain to payment. Finer une somme, finer de quelque chose is to acquit oneself of something, etc. As for the noun finance, the Dictionary of Middle French gives an interesting example taken from a late medieval narrative in verse by an anonymous merchant, again, another, written around 1320. He was a grocer, apparently. This anonymous narrative is entitled, you will ask yourself, why anonymous and how do I know he was a merchant? It's because in the narrative, the author says something about himself. So this narrative is entitled Le roman de Renard le contrefait, since the merchant forged, contrefaisait, the famous anthropomorphic character of Reynard the Fox in order to express opinions under the mask of his model. In the seventh part, the author says about Judas, I read it quickly in Middle French. Judas, quand il eut Dieu trahi, repentance moult l'envahit, quand il vit la déconvenue, n'eut qui lui fit nul aveu, car nul aïeux, car l'espérance point ne prit, pour ceux à lui pendre ce teint, ne sut en lui autre finance. Here is a tentative, really, translation. So I'm completely out of my field here. Judas, after he had betrayed God, was filled with repentance. When he saw the misfortune, he had nobody to help him, for hope didn't hold. Therefore he hung himself. He knew no other finance, no other ending. Now, it is tempting to read into this occurrence of the word finance the rejection of one of its senses, money, for the sake of another, especially, the other one being end or ending, especially if we recall that this passage, draws on Matthew 27:3-5, where it is said, I quote, "When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. 'I have sinned,' he said, 'for I have betrayed innocent blood.' 'What is that to us?' they replied. 'That's your responsibility.' So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself." So when finance, as money, has to be gotten rid of, interestingly, finance as ending substitutes for it. Though the etymology of finance has led us to Middle French, we should also recall the history of the word in English, which is very close. Thus, to fine, a verb that means to punish a person for an illegal act by requiring her to pay a sum of money. To fine has long had the now obsolete sense of to bring to an end, to complete, conclude, both senses deriving from the Middle French finer. And the noun, fine, also has these two meanings. The sense of ending for fine is still alive in Shakespeare's All's Well That Ends Well, when Helena declares at the end of Act 4, Scene 4, I quote, "All's well that ends well, still defines the crown, whatever the course, the end is the renown. End of quote. So the crown, that is to say the power, the ultimate and sovereign authority, Shakespeare suggests, lies in the ending that will be remembered, renowned. It resides in what could still be called, according to the lexicons of the time, think of the English expositor, the finance or finance of a storyline. The question that awaits us, now that finance or finance as ending has come to an end or has exhausted its former meaning, is the following. Isn't finance, on the contrary, becoming synonymous with infinitude? And if it is, what made that possible? When would finance have come to mean the unfinishable or the infinite, the infinance? And hence, since when would finance maybe have become impossible to narrate? This is a debatable question. There are many stories to be told that would constitute as many tentative answers to these questions. Like Scheherazade, I will lend my voice to one of these stories, postponing the others, deferring them until another night or day, though I'm not sure that I subscribe without reservations, neither does Scheherazade, I guess, to what I'm about to tell. And I'm heading toward a conclusion. Benjamin's essay on the storyteller famously opens by diagnosing the end of storytelling. I quote, "The art of storytelling," he writes, "is coming to an end, zu Ende geht." In other, more ancient words, storytelling, Benjamin suggests, is reaching its finance. I quote again, "Less and less frequently do we encounter people with the ability to tell a tale properly. More and more often, there is embarrassment all around when the wish to hear a story is expressed. It is as if something that seemed inalienable, unveräußerlich, to us, the securest among our possessions, were taken from us, the ability to exchange experiences and Erfahrungen auszutauschen." Storytelling as trading in experiences, as swapping, borrowing, or lending one's life stories, storytelling as an economic practice, in some, has long been inalienable, says Benjamin, that is to say, unforfeitable or untransferable, precisely as the condition of all experiential transfers. But it has recently become preempted, so to speak, he says. It has been seized or confiscated. The reason Benjamin mentions for this dispossession as one reason among others is puzzling, though. I quote, "One reason for this phenomenon is obvious," he writes, "experience has fallen in value. Die Erfahrung ist im Kurse gefallen." Maybe more literally, its exchange rate or its stock market quotation has fallen. Now, why would the devaluation of experience lead to the deprivation of the precious ability to share it? One could think, on the contrary, that the less valuable experience supposedly becomes, the more common its sharing would be. Visit my Facebook page, and I guess yours is not much better. In any case, having long been the securest among our possessions, having long been the safest guarantee in experiential economics, the ability to tell stories seems to have shared the status of death, of finance, we could say in Middle French. It is not surprising, then, that Benjamin, later in the essay, considers death as the source of authority in storytelling. And death, he writes, is being devalued too. It loses its status as the gold standard against which stories can be weighed or evaluated. I quote a long quotation from the essay. "The thought of death has declined, ein Buße leidet," it has suffered losses, and this is again a financial expression. The thought of death has declined in omnipresence and vividness. Dying was once a public process in the life of the individual and the most exemplary one. Today, people live in rooms that have never been touched by death, dry dwellers of eternity, and when their end approaches, they are stowed away in sanatoria or hospitals by their heirs. It is, however, characteristic that not only a man's knowledge or wisdom, but above all his real life, sein gelebtes Leben, his life as he lived it, and this is the stuff that stories are made of, first assumes transmissible form at the moment of his death. Just as a sequence of images is set in motion inside a man as his life comes to an end, suddenly in his expressions and looks, the unforgettable emerges and imparts to everything that concerned him that authority which even the poorest wretch in dying possesses for the living around him. This authority is at the very source of the story. We could seek the confirmation of the devaluation of death in the fascinating scene towards the end of Goethe's second Faust, soon after the last line pronounced by Faust and quoted by Benjamin in his 1933 essay on experience and poverty, written 3 years before the storyteller. Mephisto has just pronounced Faust dead. Es ist vollbracht, he says, it is finished, borrowing Christ's last words in John 19:30. And the Lemures, the spirits or shadows of the departed in Roman mythology, echo him by declaring, "It is over, es ist vorbei." Mephisto briefly argues with them about this stupid word. "Why over?" he exclaims. "What's over and mere nothing are the same." As if Mephisto were questioning the possibility that Faust's life is finally absolved, that is to say, complete. And indeed, in the very moment when the redeeming of Faust's debt coincides with the ending of his life, after all, Faust's soul, as we know, has to go to Mephisto as a way of paying him back. In this very instant, death seems to lose the punctuality and hence the trustworthiness that allowed it to function as a reliable asset. The passage is masterfully prepared by the insistence of the Lemures on the economics of existence. I quote, "All items were on short-term loan," they say, while burying Faust in his grave, "and creditors are many." And here is Mephisto's lament that follows. Established usages and ancient rites, there's nothing we can count on anymore. The soul used to emerge when someone breathed his last. I'd lie in wait, and like the nimblest mouse, snap, it was clenched within my claws. But now it hesitates to leave that dreary place, its noisome home inside a worthless corpse. Old death has lost his former metal, the alte Tod verloor die rasche Kraft, so has lost its expediting power. I've often coveted some limbs in rigor mortis, illusion only, they stirred and began to move again. End of quote. So the ending becomes dubious, Mephisto complains, as does the paying off of the debt of existence. Death is diluted, it is losing its contours, and the lender is afraid he won't get his investment back. Faust's finance can hardly be trusted. Perhaps it is already on the way to what we could call, in the light of the fascinating history of this word, its infinite infinance. Thank you very much.